The occasion. It has been 60 years since the passage of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. That legislation outlawed major forms of racial discrimination in the areas of employment, education, housing, and access to public accommodations. Leading up to and immediately after passage of the civil rights legislation, race relations in the United States existed in a state of confusion that resulted in civil disturbances in the, all across the U.S., including Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington, Delaware was, as I said, was one of many cities in the U.S., particularly after the death of Martin Luther King, that experienced civil unrest and racial tension. 2018 will mark the 50th anniversary of the Wilmington Riots. More than a half a century after passage of the legislation in the Wilmington Riots, the social, political, and economic plight of blacks in Delaware and all across America continues to lag behind whites. Delaware, with its racial and socioeconomic diversity, geographic location, and historical significance to the black liberation struggle, provides an ideal laboratory to examine the what and why questions regarding the continuation of racial disparities in America. Delaware has many of the same problems as the larger cities, yet it's small enough to reflect the problems of many large cities, many states, but yet it reflects many of the problems of large cities and metropolitan areas. The University of Delaware, through its commitment to community engagement, has the potential to become one of the leading universities examining racial disparities and sharing what we learn with the community at large. The university's community engagement initiative notes, quote, "One of the measures of every great research university is the extent to which the knowledge it generates enriches the quality of life and the commitment in the communities it serves." Accordingly, the goals of tonight's program are twofold. First, to introduce the Delaware Black Community Research Project. We refer to it as DBCRP. Sometimes I think it's easier for me to say the name out as opposed to saying the acronyms. The aim of this project is to establish a collaborative and interdisciplinary research space devoted to the promotion and dissemination of information. The outcomes of the Delaware Black Community Research Project will encourage the development of progressive and transformative policies and solutions to racism and racial disparities in the areas of education, employment, and income distribution. The second goal of tonight's program is to engage black leaders and community leaders and scholars in a discussion and an examination of where the black community was in the late 1960s at the time of the Wilmington Riots, and where the black community is today, and where black Delawareans are headed as a political community. The foundation of the Delaware Black Community Research Project is critical race theory. Critical race theory recognizes that race and racism are ingrained in the fabric and systems of American society. And one of the key tenets of critical race theory is storytelling or counter-storytelling. So storytelling gives people a means to frame their reality and to explore their experiences with racial oppression. Tonight's program is the first in a series of programs designed to inform, to gather data, and to give Delaware's black community an opportunity to tell its story and to help formulate an agenda for addressing issues of racial disparities in the state. Before we bring up the guests and we start the conversation, I'm going to take a moment and this is a working paper that will be available online very soon as we get the website up and we'll be providing information about that in a few minutes. But one of the things, as I mentioned to you, for the past 8 to 9 years, I have been doing, my research focus kind of changed to focus on issues of governance, good governance, and poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa. And about 2 years ago, I was in Namibia. I was given a paper. I was talking about poverty. I was talking about quality of life. I was talking about standards of living. And it just all of a sudden, it dawned on me. Here I am, close to 10,000 miles away from home, talking about problems of poverty. And all I have to do is just kind of drive, get in my car and drive 14 miles north of where I live. And I've got plenty of poverty. I've got plenty of issues that need, in our community, that needs to be addressed. And as a result, I began to kind of refocus my effort in terms of thinking about Delaware, because Delaware is believe it or not, is a wonderful little laboratory. We got urban, we've got rural, we've got suburban. As I said before, it's got the problems of big cities, it's got the problems of states, and it's all within like 90 miles by 35. So you can drive up and down the state 4 times and still it's 1 o'clock in the daytime. So so that's one of the things. But in any event, I started, as I said, I'm collecting all kinds of data. We're going to make this data available. We're going to do some analysis. Our aim as an academic program, how best can I put this? We're not necessarily the foot soldiers, but our objective is to give the foot soldiers the information they need to be successful. This is a program that we're putting together, even though it's called the Delaware Black Community Research Project. Our focus may be on blacks as a community, but the outcomes will benefit all of Delaware. So it's not, I don't want people to get hung up on the fact that it's the Black Community Research Project. But as I mentioned earlier to our guests, there's a saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And so the thing is, how do we kind of build a stronger Delaware? We build a stronger Delaware by building stronger community all across the board. So I put this paper together. So it's a working paper. So I haven't, as I say, it's a working paper. And in examining it, I came up with the title because this is kind of the reality. The racial disparities remain deep in Delaware 50 years after the Kerner Commission reports and the Wilmington Riots. When we start talking about the nature of the problem, back in 1963, 2 authors wrote in terms of, and by the way, they were white. They said white people may have thought little about Negroes until recently, but most Negroes can't ignore the white man. The white man holds the key to the freedoms, comforts, and pleasures Negroes aspire to. And it is the white man who has prevented Negroes from achieving these things. How the Negro views the white man is important, but white society must eventually come to grips with Negro demands. In 1968, really between 1968 and 1965 and 1968, there was a series of race riots. There was a great deal of racial tension throughout the U.S. in many cities. President Johnson came forth, and President Johnson put together an advisory committee to study the problem. And the committee was called the National Advisory Committee on Civil Disorder. It was later, it's often referred to as the Kerner Commission because Governor Kerner of Ohio chaired the commission, and so as kind of, is always the case. It's easier to kind of stick the chairman's name on the commission. President Johnson gave this commission the task of addressing three fundamental questions in terms of what was leading up to these race riots, what happened, why it happened, and what should be done to prevent it from happening again. Many of you are familiar with this particular conclusion, because this is the basic conclusion, and this is the thing that a lot of people have kind of held on from the Kerner Commission, in which it said our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and equal. And that was unequal, excuse me. That's why I like my panelists. They're going to keep me straight. Separate and unequal. And so this is kind of one of those things that we need to begin to kind of, in revisiting this 50 years later, where are we? The Kerner Commission basically found when it comes to blacks in America in the 1960s, there were a number of things, but there were four, what I call the top grievances. There were four of the top grievances, although there were altogether maybe 11 or 12. And it said the thing that blacks were most dissatisfied with in the 1960s were police practices, unemployment and underemployment, inadequate housing, and inadequate education. So this becomes, once I saw this, I said, okay, they have basically set up for us kind of the measuring stick. This becomes kind of the yardstick by which we kind of compare progress in terms of where we today relative to where we were then. So the aim of this presentation is to ponder the degree that racial disparities continue to persist 50 years after the Kerner Commission report and the Wilmington Riots. So the objectives are threefold. First thing I want to do is just to examine differences in standards of living along racial lines in Delaware, to consider the level of consistency in blacks and whites' perceptions of the most important issues facing Delaware, and to examine the nature of blacks and whites' perceptions of the behavior of local law enforcement. So I'm going to go through some data pretty quickly, but just to give you an idea of where we are. So this particular frame look at, in 2015, racial differences in income as an indicator of standard of living. What's the takeaway? The median, in other words, another way to look at this, in 2015, the average white family had $15,000 more to spend that year than the average black family. Now we're talking about averages here. The median in terms of household, and household is the kind of the standard measure that we're using now. We're not using family income. When we talk about household can comprise of any combination of individuals. Family, we generally kind of think of that in terms of husband, wife, children. Household could be two adults, it could be any combination. And again, in terms of household income, the average white family had $18,000 more to spend that year. Per capita income, think of this way. If we took all of the money that whites made in 2015, we divided it up, and we gave it to each white person in Delaware would have gotten $34,000. We did the same thing with black income. Each black person would have gotten $23,000. Now, this may look as if this is kind of, okay, so these differences exist, but one of the things we need to understand in terms of the economic power of blacks in Delaware, blacks have a great degree of economic power. As a matter of fact, the income of blacks in 2015 was $4.7 billion. That's greater than 17 sub-Saharan African nations. So we have to think about in terms of the resources are there. Sometimes it's not about what what you have, it's about how you use what you have that can be the problem. We looked at poverty rate. Blacks, we could look at this as 1 in every 5 blacks in Delaware lived in poverty compared to 1 in every 10 whites. Family poverty, it's the same, but when you notice in terms of families where you have a stronger, when we look at families, things have a tendency to decline. This perhaps though is very unimpressive in terms of when we look at children in poverty, 31%, so that's what 3 in every 10 black children in Delaware live in poverty compared to 1 in every 10. So this is a huge issue here. We look at education. So we have closed the gap significantly in terms of high school graduates, but I'm very concerned about this because a high school degree in this day, in this economy, is equivalent to dropping out 50 years ago, right? You really need, you got to have kind of a college degree, which is equivalent to a high school degree of 50 years ago. While this gap has almost disappeared, this has changed very little. As a matter of fact, it has went up slightly in terms of college graduates. Let me just give you an example of another important thing to run facts by you in terms of why this is very important. For every 1% increase, and this is in Delaware in 2015, for every 1% increase in black college graduates in the community, there was a $1,078 increase in the black household income. For every 1% increase in blacks in communities in Delaware, there was a 0.5% decline in poverty in black poverty in Delaware. So this is very significant in terms of when we talk about education closing that particular gap. So here are a few other things when we talk about unemployment. Blacks had about 7.1% compared to about 4%. Home ownership, only about half of the blacks in Delaware own their homes compared to close to 80% of whites. So the question now, moving on in terms of, so blacks and whites perception in terms of what do we need to do? And this is a way of thinking about how do we need to spend governmental resources. Among blacks, the two things that were most concerned to blacks in 2014 was they wanted more money spent on employment, wages, they want jobs, and public safety was another big concern. As a matter of fact, a higher percent said public safety than wages. Amongst whites, this was also a concern, jobs, wages, but that's about 5% percentage points lower than whites. Education, school funding, I was surprised at the low number amongst both groups, but I guess jobs and public safety becomes a real issue. And then amongst whites, public safety isn't that big of a deal because there are other, now you gotta understand there were a whole host of other things that they could have chosen, but it doesn't rise to the same level as blacks. So my conclusion from this was, in terms of blacks and whites, perceptions of what's important, at least now we're in the same ballpark, we're just in different ends of the field in terms of how do we spend our revenues. The other question you remember that we talked about that was a big issue out of the Kerner report was police relations with the black community. So the question was asked in terms of how do you feel about police departments in Delaware holding officers accountable. Only 25% of blacks felt that police departments in Delaware held their officers accountable compared to 62% of whites. This question was in feeling about police use of the right amount of force. About 36% of blacks felt that they used the right amount of force. Now, that also means close to 60% felt that the police officers didn't. But again, we look at whites. Whites have a tendency to feel that law enforcement officers are treating them much better and with respect. And then the final thing was, the question was, do police departments in Delaware treat racial and ethnic groups equally? Only 30% of blacks said they do, compared to 61% of whites. So, you know, whether this is kind of real or whether this is kind of, I won't say it's not certainly a figment of anyone's imagination, but there's an issue here. The other thing that concerned me, I kind of disaggregated this data, and I compared blacks in the city, in Wilmington, to blacks in the suburbs and in rural areas, and it didn't matter. And I also I found something really interesting, because I thought that this group would comprise primarily of blacks who are what we call your higher socioeconomic status. It didn't. They were probably just as likely as lower socioeconomic status blacks to be concerned about law enforcement. It was the blacks with high school and some college who had a tendency to be more satisfied, but that's for Jeopardy. A trivia question, maybe we'll have a Delaware Jeopardy at some point. So some closing thoughts. Whether real or perceived, blacks in Delaware still consider the police departments in the state to be a threat to ethnic and racial minorities. So it's an issue. I'm not saying that there's a problem, but if people perceive that there's a problem, there's a problem. Reality is what we make reality out to be, right? So this is something that's an important issue. Did I skip? Yeah, I skipped one, excuse me. Based on these simple descriptive analysis, racial and socioeconomic inequality continues to exist in Delaware nearly 50 years after the Wilmington Riots and the 1968 Kerner Commission reports. Sections of Wilmington have become a classic example of the formation of racial ghettos that were mentioned in the Kerner Commission report. And as I said earlier, metaphorically speaking, when it comes to black and white Delawareans, what we see as the most important issues there, we're in the same ballpark, but we're in different parts of the field. So the bottom line to that particular statement is that, you know, there's hope. There's hope, and the environment is such that progress can be made. Short of the business community leaders, elected officials, and policy decision makers taking progressive action to reduce racial disparities in education, employment, and labor market opportunities, and income inequality, meaning unrest, could happen in Delaware again. So I mean, I guess that can be up for debate. So I'm going to kind of close with my final thought, and then I'm going to invite our guests to come up, and we can start the conversation. My final thought is, and someone told me, oh wow, you need to frame that in a question, because otherwise it seems fairly negative. And I said, okay, I'll do that, I agree with you. But 50 years after the Kerner Commission report, is the black community itself moving towards, because I think sometimes my thing is you have to kind of get home straight before you start trying to tackle issues elsewhere. But is the black community itself moving towards two societies, one affluent, one trapped in disadvantaged social and economic enclaves, increasingly separate and unequal? First panelist is Mr. James Baker, and I've asked him to focus on the political climate. He's the former mayor of Wilmington. Mayor Baker has held staff and executive positions with private and governmental agencies in Wilmington. He was Wilmington's first black city council president. He's an author of the book, The Genuine American Music, a 2-volume encyclopedia of black musicians. Our second speaker, and this may not be the order in which they will be called upon, but is Ms. Beatrice Coker, and she told me call her BB. I've asked her to kind of think about and to focus on education and family life in Delaware around the time of the Wilmington Riots. Ms. Coker, or BB as she likes to be called, is a retired social worker and a longtime educational advocate. She is a playwright, poet, and lyricist. Next is Ms. Beatrice Patton Dixon. I've asked her to speak on black women in Delaware, at least to kind of think about the role of black women in the black liberation struggle in Delaware during that particular time. She's a former mayoral candidate, community activist, and female trailblazer in Delaware politics. She's a native of Wilmington, a public administrator with more than 35 years of experience. She has extensive and impressive record in community and civic involvement in the city. Next to her is Bishop Aretha Morton, and I've asked her to kind of, now they will be speaking on other issues, but just for purposes of trying to put things together, I've kind of asked people to think about and reflect on a particular area. And her area is religion and the black community. She's the Delaware State Bishop for the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship International. She's a longtime pastor, female pioneer. Recently, the 400 block of Washington Street in Wilmington was renamed in her honor. Next is Professor Leland Ware. I've asked him to focus on the legal climate around the time of the 60s, and I'm quite sure he might even go back to the 50s and move forth. Professor Ware is the Lewis Redding Professor and the Chair for the Study of Law and Public Policy here at the University of Delaware. Before his appointment at UD, he was a professor at St. Louis University School of Law, and he was also a trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice. Professor Ware's research focuses on various aspects of civil rights law. Dr. Donald Morton, he's the pastor at Tabernacle Baptist Church. He's executive director of Complexities of Color Coalition. So with that said, as I said, I have asked each speaker, I'm going to pose a question to them, and they're going to have 6 to 8 minutes to respond, and afterwards, and I'll move on. And so we will start with Professor Ware. The question for Professor Ware centers around the idea that what a lot of people don't know and may not be aware of is that Delaware has played a major role in blacks' quest for equal protection. I mean, there are a number of cases that have come out of Delaware that really has played a role in terms of addressing issues of discrimination. And so the question for Professor Ware, and he doesn't have to go directly on this, but what were the core legal concerns and issues facing the black community immediately before and after the Wilmington Riots?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me, Professor Davis. As you know, or may know, Delaware was one of the cities on one of the cases that went to the Supreme Court collectively as Brown versus Board of Education. And Delaware, the Delaware group was represented by Lewis Redding, whose name my chair was developed. And so I want to narrow the focus a bit to education and the relationship of education to incarceration.
Leland, can you pull it a little closer to you? Yeah.
So so the issue then in the 50s was integrating and ending Jim Crow segregation. And that happened, at least legally, with the Brown case, and later with the civil rights laws of 1964, 5, and 8, specifically Title VI of the 1964 Act. So the question is, where are we now? And where we are now is, instead of having discrimination and segregation, we now have discrimination and segregation inside of public schools. Mm-hmm. So one rather shocking thing I learned in some research that I was doing is that in 2012, the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Division engaged in an investigation of the Christina School District and found that discipline was imposed more frequently and with heavier penalties on African American students than white students who engaged in the same conduct. Now, it's important to understand that black children don't act up more than white children. Many researchers have found that the large and persistent overrepresentation of African American students in misconduct referrals was not attributable to their socioeconomic status or differences in their behavior. So when researchers control for differences in behavior, student demeanor, personality traits, grades, and other factors, African American students were more likely to be disciplined and had more disciplinary reports than white students. Now, 2 years later, in 2014, the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Division did a nationwide study and found the exact same disparities. So black students nationwide represent 16% of the student population, but 32 to 42 of students suspended or expelled. White students, who made up over half of students enrolled in schools, represented only about 31 to 40% of the students who were disciplined. And indeed, female African American students are suspended and disciplined more frequently than girls of any other race and ethnicity, as well as most boys of other racial or ethnic identities. Now, this is the rub, or this is where the relationship of education and incorporation come together. It's something called the school to prison pipeline. So 27% of black students were referred to law enforcement officials, and 31 were involved in school-related arrests. White students, representing 41% of the enforcement referrals, represent 41% and 39% of the arrests. So these disparities obviously did not occur by chance. So what's happening is that black students are being more harshly disciplined, they're being pushed out of schools, they're being arrested and put in handcuffs and at just an alarming rate. So this means an entire generation of black students are being denied education and being put into the criminal justice system. So this is a real crisis that we have here on our hands. Now, I did some other research to try to figure out what's going on, and the racism that occurs today is not the old-fashioned in-your-face, using the N-word kind of racism. It's much more subtle, and it's what's called unconscious discrimination. So we all have these subconscious biases that are developed between the ages of 3 and 5. And it's based on images that you see on TV, what you see online, what you read. But these stereotypes are pretty stock. The big black scary guy, black criminals, blacks are lazy. And so these stereotypes get involved in the ways in which teachers view students. And they make assumptions about black students as being not engaged in the educational process, or being, discipline problems, or being threatening. And indeed, the research I found, I was alarmed to know this, but most white teachers are just afraid, physically afraid of black students. And most white police officers are scared of black men. And so that's why you have all this stuff going on. And this. So the teachers aren't saying, hey, Joe, you're black, I'm going to put you out of school. But they just assume from Jump Street that this boy is a problem. They talk to their colleagues, oh, Willie here is a problem. So we have really a tremendous problem. So there is no achievement gap, there's a treatment gap. So if the teacher is looking at you and saying you're no good or you're dumb, the student knows that. So what are they supposed to do? Be all happy and smiles? They don't like that. So so from the beginning, there's just a terrible relationship, or a relationship of hostility. And so the students are in a hostile learning environment. So how can they learn, or how can they achieve if they're going into a situation every day in which the teachers are assuming they can't learn and they ain't no good? And so now they've taken school discipline, go to the back of the room or go take a time out. Instead, they're calling the police, okay? And so we, again, have a crisis. An entire generation of black students are worse off today than their grandparents were in the 1950s.
Okay, thank you. Bishop Morton, leading up to the Wilmington Riots, the faith community was a very important part of black life and the black liberation struggle. So we want to ask you, if you don't mind, elaborating on the role of the black church leading up to, in the community, leading up to the Wilmington Riots.
Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. As we know it, the faith community has always been what we would call the forerunner of dealing with whatever problems occur in our communities. It's always said, what church do you go to? When something happens, it's maybe you ought to go to church. It's always been also one of the most segregated places, especially on Sunday morning. Sunday morning, you'll find the African American church is filled with African Americans. I'm talking about a little of then, okay? Now it's somewhat different, but then it was, that's basically the way that it was. I was born in the city of Wilmington 79 years ago. So being a member of one church, which was located at 9th and French, was Easian Church, which is now called Easian Mount Carmel Church, located on Walnut Street. But we've got to understand that the church was needed, the faith community was needed then, and of course the faith community is needed now. And as much as we might seem, and it does seem sometimes, those of us that are leaders in the faith community, it does seem as if we're not needed. But one thing that I do understand is that as soon as something happens, folk run to the church. We've got churches filled now just because of the president. Yeah, you can laugh at that because it's true. In 9/11, when that occurred, the churches filled up because they needed something to hold on to. But we need to also understand that the church is just not bricks and mortar, but it's a living organism, always prepared to accommodate, and not only that, but we're supposed to be, the faith community is supposed to be leaders in everything that occurs in society. Whether it be police brutality, we should be there. Whether it be segregation problems, we should be there. Back in '68, I think I had been in ministry about 9 years. So that's 50 years ago when I first started. I was employed at Gordon's Jewelers at 8th and Market. And when the riots broke out, they slipped a piece of paper under our door, and it said, "Burn, baby, burn." And the manager of the store said to me, "Well, we have to wait until the Chamber of Commerce tells us we can close." And at that time, I wasn't quite as reverenced as I am now. And I said, "Well, you stay here and wait for them to burn you up, but I'm going home." It was a trying time, From what I understand, April the 7th, I believe it was, 1968, the faith leaders got together in Rodney Square, and they had prayer and all of that sort of thing, but stuff still burned. It still burned. But we have to look at, I started last semester at University of Delaware with African American Studies. And I did that because I certainly understood that there is more to segregation, more to this and that and the other than just what is talked about in February. So there was a need for me to find out more. And what I found, even from the data that you showed on the screen, not too much has changed. When we look at the police issues and the unemployment and all of that in the state of Delaware, city of Wilmington, not too much has changed. And they've taken us from 1,500 to, I think last week we dealt with the Black Panthers. So there's a lot that we need to understand that is still the same, if I've answered your question.
Okay, you have. Thank you. Mayor Baker, coming out of the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of hope placed on capturing the political environment to improve Black standards of living. How was the political climate for Blacks around the time of the riots, and how are things different today?
Well, at the time of the riots, it was interesting because you had the first African-American elected at large, which was Jim Sills, and you had 3 African-American council members from the 5th, 4th, and 3rd District You had Wade Hampton, you had Harry Thomas, and Hattie Phelan, and that was in 1968 when the riots started. You also had Judge Williams, who was in the court because Wilmington at that time ran the municipal court and had power over it. So you had some inroads, but in '68, the advent of Martin Luther King's assassination just blew it at the top off. It didn't matter who was what, who was big or little or whatever. There wasn't any real control. It just went out of control. And people forget that in 1967, we had a riot in 1967, but it was a smaller one, and it was in West Center City, and they did some damage, but it wasn't like '68. '68, there was burning, which in '67, it was just breaking windows and stuff like that. And what's also interesting that the young men, there are a few young ladies, but most of them were young guys, did not see themselves as rioters. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. So if you told them they were rioters, they probably would sock you in your face. And the other interesting thing was, even though they busted out places and did all that, they weren't the ones looting. The looters were people around 30-some years old, 40, up to their 60s. They waited for these young kids, and once they tore open a store or something, the next day they would come and just have a feast, take whatever they needed. So there was all these misunderstandings about what this was all about and what was going on. The fires originally were specifically set for specific places. They just forgot that fire doesn't necessarily stop at that place. It just goes wherever it went. So the political situation at the time was not very good for African Americans, because at that time you had powerful party power. They ran things through the party, not through the politics of individualism that you may see today. Then the party ran it. I remember when Mayor Haskell, who was a Republican, got elected after the riots. He defeated Mayor Babiars, who was a Democrat. Mayor Haskell didn't have to deal with city council. He went to the chair of the Democratic Party to discuss what he wanted to get passed in city council. So that was a different era then. There was much more power in the parties than you will see today. Parties have no power today. They're just talkers. But if you look at the '72 election, the advent of the riots and everything else, only 2 African Americans got elected in that year. African Americans lost everything, lost the mayoral race, lost the city council president race, lost district council races. Hattie Phelan from the east side got elected, and I got elected from West Center City area. So there was only 2 of us then, and there's been much progress and change over the years. But I want people to understand something, that politics at certain levels have certain powers, and they are not going to solve all the damaging problems that you listed. You can go to the city government all you want talking about poverty and talking about unemployment and talking about all of that kind of stuff. They're not going to solve those problems. But people think they do or should. They will not. And they will not even solve the police problem. What we don't seem to get is that the education system is totally incompetent. Totally incompetent. You can't tell me that our education system turns around and tells you they can't teach our children. Yet they will throw 60% of city kids out of the school and tell us that, oh, we're trying. We're really working at, yeah, right. Give me another lie. If you look at the economic disparities, they've been that way, and they will continue until there is a change in our viewpoint about economics. For example, the wealth differential in the nation, not just in Delaware, between a white family and an African-American family is staggering. $130,000 for a white family, $6,000 for an African-American family. These kind of disparities cannot continue and say you're going to make progress because you've got permanent poor people now living in most of these urban areas, mostly African-American and Hispanic, and it's been that way for year after year after year. Urban renewal was a disaster at the time it was put in Wilmington. It was a disaster. They tore down houses all over. They tore down the East Side, Project A. They tore down houses in West Center City because they moved all the people from East Side to West and everywhere they could go to. And then they came in and said that they were going to fix up East Side and West Side.
Yeah.
Bought up all these houses, and then the federal government, with its infinite wisdom, cut the money, and they couldn't fix up the houses. So they stood vacant for years. And if you remember Project A on the east side, look how long it took before anything was even built on that land. It stayed vacant for years, 20-some years. It was vacant because they couldn't do anything with it. If you look at the family problems in Wilmington, for families with children under 18 in the African American community, 80% are headed by single women. 80%. And we pay no attention to it. These are just figures. I'll throw them out and we'll nod our head and that'll be about it. Most of the young people in prison have fifth grade level education. You cannot talk about employment at fifth grade. There's no job that's available for a fifth grader. And all we hear is, we need jobs, we need jobs. Well, that's fine. You dumbass, you keep talking about a daggone job.
I knew it was coming.
It's not gonna happen. Sorry if I get angry at this, because we've talked about it for so long.
Yeah.
You're right.
And the data has come over and over and over again. And the disparities keep going and going and going. And all we get is a nice little talk and a pat on the back. What else did we have here? We had over 65% home ownership in West Center City in '68. We almost had 70% home ownership. We had 80% home ownership in the East Side.
That's right. I was wrong.
Today we have 65% rental in West Center City, 65% rental in East Side, over 80% rental in Northeast. Are we ever going to talk about home ownership in reality? Okay. Now that I got my spleen all. So the real thing is that politics within itself is not the answer to all these problems that we've been talking about. It's going to take a lot of people with good intentions, and not just good intentions, but it's going to take a real strong, committed, honest effort to deal with it. I've got to the age now where it doesn't matter about what anybody thinks of me. When I was mayor, I didn't care. You criticize me, so go to hell. I don't care.
That's right. And we love you for it.
Because I don't believe that you're supposed to get elected and let people beat up on you because you're an elected official. I voted for you. So what? What's that got to do with the price of tea in China? I got to run a city. I haven't got time to worry about whether you voted for me or not. Dum-dums. So we really need to have an honest exploration. I really appreciate all of the people like here. Professor Ware has been very, very good about doing the job that he does. And this lady's crazy, and she's crazy. And this lady's been holding on for so many years. She gave me my first line of credit
Yeah.
at Gordon Jewelers.
Sure did.
I paid her
He
back.
paid his bill too.
I paid. I know how we're not supposed to pay, but I did.
Yeah, I got you.
But anyways, people, stop this nonsense.
Yeah, you're right.
If you elect an African American, for example, to any political office, stop this crazy, stupid idea that your life is going to change. Oh my goodness, everything, Obama got elected. Why isn't our lives changed? It's not gonna. It's up to the people to change and to make things better. This institution here has to change itself about African Americans who attend this institution, who work for this institution. You got more money than God, and you sit here talking about, oh. And I know this university got a lot of money. Don't tell me you don't, because I know. If any of you do, just check out their little portfolio. You can find out how much money they got. But it's all over. It's just everywhere you go. It's not just, you talk about the shootings, and you have these stupid magazines talking about Wilmington, the most dangerous city in the nation for its size and all that. That's nonsense.
Murder Town, USA.
It's data massacre. Because here's what the problem is. The problem is within the African American youth, where you have 14 to about 24. They are the ones using the weapons against each other. They are the ones dying. And we pretend that there's a crime problem, and we're not even dealing with how does these young men get the idea that it's all right to take a life like that. We don't talk about the fact is how did that gun get in his hand so easily? We're not dealing with all those things. So politics can be damned, but it's more than just that. I really believe that the Reverend and all of the people who really used to be the ones that everybody ran to at the beginning, that we really need to get together.
Before we move on, though, that you mentioned that the young men saw themselves as freedom fighters and not rioters.
That's right.
In other words, they were kind of, I guess it was just kind of a civil disobedience in terms of, I mean, they were protesting unjust laws, so they weren't just out there fighting and rioting to be rioting, that they truly were frustrated and had a feeling of hopelessness. Ms. Coker, Bibi,
Here we go.
educationally, some blacks have done well, while others in the educational system, others it seems like the educational system has failed. So what was the educational environment like then, and how does it differ now?
Well, I just want to say, for one thing, I just want to say that now that you've heard former Mayor Baker, just remember, there were about 11 of us that worked on a committee together to protest to get open housing and public accommodations. You see how he is now, old. Imagine what it was like working with him when he was younger. We survived, but we did a lot of stuff. I think that the one thing we need to recognize is that the system of public education was never designed for us. Okay. So we kind of got in on the fringes of everything. I would say to you, the one thing I'd bring to your attention that you may or may not know, there were about 11 of us that fiercely protested desegregation, simply because, look it up for yourself on the internet, schools by law were not segregated, housing was. So here we go, getting distracted again, and we're gonna act like the schools are closed and they're no good and all this kind of stuff. If you go back and look at the stats from the schools that had the largest, or the, what do you call it, majority attendance by our children, they graduated, they went to school. Some few were suspended, but not, you know, any wholesale anything. Kids were doing fine. Schools were doing fine. There were certain things that we did not have, like I would want, brand new playground equipment at the Harlan School.
Right.
Okay? Nobody had it. 3 years later, at the time of desegregation, we go by the school, they got the fence up, they got the building painted, and they have the playground equipment. And I use that as an example to show my children, this is what you call racism. You can't get a new swing, but they can. That's the kind of blatant stuff that really irritates me. I grew up in a segregated school system in the South. I can count the kids on one hand that didn't go to college. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. Went to Staten High School, where they wrote the so-called Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Now, if anybody says that I was there in 1901 when they wrote it, I'm gonna smack them, 'cause that ain't what happened. But we sang that song, and today, I can't even sing that third verse without crying, because it means a lot to us. But I guess what I'm saying to you is this: we have allowed the term integration and desegregation to not give itself or get a full and valuable meaning. If somebody had said to me that they wanted to desegregate the schools, don't talk about busing. We fought busing like we actually put a brief in federal court. You had to have a remedy. Our remedy was bust the teachers and let the children walk to school. Nobody listened, but we got friend of the court status. But I guess what I'm saying to you is, if you had said to me that the desegregation of public schools would not have anything to do with our children having to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go way across town or down to Newark or wherever, the Sam Hill, to get an education, I would have been fine with that, because you were saying to me that we're going to desegregate the facilities. Every child does not learn the same, but I'm going to provide you with resources equally. However, I will help you to see that children learn differently, but at least you're going to have equality, but there will be a difference in how we are taught, not because we're stupid. What I'm saying to you is that if you really look at education, and I think Dr. Ware will back me up on this, if you really want to solve a problem in terms of crime and that sort of thing, stop fighting criminals. Fight institutions that produce criminals. We aren't serious about this thing. I'm saying to you, all children learn differently. You think about it, and maybe I'm just old and have thought about it for too long. They do these standardized test things. All kids aren't standardized. They don't make standardized kids. So everybody's not going to learn the same. Plus the fact you're finding out what a child knows, but you don't know what they don't know, and nobody wants to go back and let's say, okay, let's work on this. Those are the kinds of schools that we had before desegregation. We had people that listened. We had people that made us study. We had people that expected something of us. We had people that respected us, and we respected them. And if you did anything, the word got home before you even thought about leaving school.
And we didn't have telephones.
Thank you. It sure wasn't. No portable. But it's just the idea that a lot of times we kind of need to stop and rethink things. It's like Jim will tell you, and Bishop Morton, right now it's like you get tired of hearing people talk and have sessions and want to hear stuff. So we got a little crew, a little old folks crew, and we go over to places like Plummer. The fellows are on parole and probation. We teach them how to read. And what we do first is thank them for trusting us enough to teach them how to read. And I can't speak for everybody, but we have one-on-one. You don't teach a black man to read in a group. It's disrespectful.
That's right.
So what we do is we do that. We also have what's called, I call it, for want of a better term, on the computer, we have Plato-like for adults. And it's a GED program. So nobody needs to know where you are. You're sitting next to me, you're on the 6th grade level. I'm sitting next to you, I'm on the 3rd grade. I don't want you to know that. I'm 42 years old. So this is what we're about now. We have stopped all this stuff about, I'm going to the meeting, I'm going to the group or whatever. I may come and ask you, hey, can you help me buy some books? We read to children. We go to the libraries. We have a rock and read program. Come out in the summertime in the parks, you're going to see us. It doesn't cost anything. It just costs time. You can get people to buy books. But the police will go out, we'll get the food bank to give us breakfast. We sit up there with those kids and do breakfast and books. They love it. But I guess what I want to just share this because it's really burning on my heart. If we don't engage in the development and recreation and revision of a literate population, you're going to have people that are mayors and governors and council people and all that kind of stuff. They can't even read the sign on a post. They won't even know what is Main Street or Market Street or what's that sign say. You gotta have a literate population. You gotta help children to enjoy the library. I know people buy Kindles. Not in my house. I want to turn the page. I love the feel of the page. And actually, I think we're coming back to it, because when I saw that people were actually offering a course to young people at a college to teach them how to talk and socialize, I said, oh, Lord, I know. I'm so glad my children are out. There ain't no way I would pay any part of that tuition for you to learn how to say good morning, how are you, nice day. Are you kidding me? No. So I think that we make a mistake when we don't take our time and define terms as they should be. If you desegregate anything in a given community, we got to stop thinking that our people or African Americans just feel like if I sit next to you that I'll be able to learn. It doesn't happen by osmosis. Remember that from biology, whatever that was? It doesn't happen by osmosis. You got to put in the work. Yeah, and the last thing I'll say to you is don't try to give a whole bunch of rules and regulations without building relationships. If you don't know how a child knows how or how a child learns, and you're a teacher, no, it doesn't work. And this is one thing we've been working on. Trust me, we're working on this one. Okay, I have one daughter that's a head and neck surgeon. She can go and take your tonsils out and make all this money. Okay, you got a person, I revere teachers, good ones. You got a person that's working on your child's brain 5 days a week, 7 hours a day for 12 years of their life, and you don't think they have to be the best? Tell me, that doesn't get it, does it? Doesn't balance it. So what we need to do, I think, as a community, is to talk to higher education and say we gotta improve the quality of the person that stands in front of that classroom. That person that stands in front of that classroom is the most important person at that time. Don't tell me about poverty. Poverty ain't got nothing to do with learning. It may be I learn differently, but it doesn't mean I can't learn. So that's, I just have a thing about education. I really do.
Okay,
So
thank you. Ms. Patton Dixon, so when we talk about the role of women in the Black liberation struggle, women are often overlooked. So I ask you, what was the political and economic role of Black women in Delaware and Wilmington leading up to the Wilmington Riots, and how are things different today?
Well, I think when we talk about the role of Black women, both prior to Dr. Davis, if that had occurred in the Caucasian community, it would have been called a civil disturbance. It was in our community, so it's a riot.
Yeah.
One of the things that, the difference is that African American women have always been in the forefront of both social and economic justice movements in this country. The movements have occurred, and the movements are still occurring today. Then we were in the church, and through our involvement in the church, we were very actively involved in all of the marches. We were actively involved in all of the demonstrations. We were actively involved in all activities that took place to address the issues of social and economic inequality. Then spiritually, we as women were the backbone of the church. We supported the minister. Many pulpits would not let a woman be in the pulpit. Today, I must say, we have sitting at this table a bishop
first.
over many, many pulpits. Also, Reverend Livingston is not here, but Reverend Livingston's daughter is a minister. The need for spiritual guidance in our community has always been the basis and the foundation for how we have been able to progress as a people. And because of that, you see not only someone who was on the front line, sacrificed and did all that was necessary to move us forward as a people in Bishop Morton, but at the end of the table, the new generation of what we're doing to achieve liberation in the community is coming from her son, Reverend Dr. Morton. And the women's role in terms of education, we were in the classroom. Graduate of Howard High School, we produced doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs. Howard High School with an all African American staff and with a female as well as later Dr. Johnson in the form of a male principal was able to produce Dr. Charles Whitten, foremost authority in the world on sickle cell anemia. Now, because of his work at the CDC, we now have the sickle cell test administered all over Africa, the Mediterranean, and the United States among populations that are suffering or have a propensity to suffer from sickle cell disease. Dr. Richard Allen Williams, is in charge of cardiology at UC Cal. He developed and did the research for Bidil, which is they found that the treatment for African Americans with heart disease was a little different from the treatment for Caucasians. That treatment, they started a drug to address that. The drug is called Bidil. Usually takes 2 years for you to go through FDA to get approval for a drug. His results were so efficacious, in 6 months, the drug went on the market. It is still on the market today, and it has saved many African American lives. Howard High School's Alumni Association does a Wall of Fame celebration every year, and 4 graduates who have made outstanding contributions in the community are honored. Last year, we had a doctor, lawyer, and I call him an engineering chief. Bruce Hart, Dr. Bruce Hart, graduated in the class of '64, came to the university, got his engineering degree, went to work for Scott Paper, got his law degree, an MBA, finished that career, and then went on to get his medical degree and is now in emergency medicine at Jeff in Philadelphia. Point being, at that point, the teachers lived in our community, went to our church, we shopped where they shopped, and we were a much more intact community, and the village supported us. And the basis for most of that support came from the women, the mothers, the grandmothers, the aunts. I think not one of us at this table can tell you of a time when we went home after school that we didn't walk the walk and talk the talk. Because our mother was on every porch, on every corner, in every house, and every doorway. African American women have always been in the forefront of rearing our children, educating our children, spiritually supporting our children, spiritually supporting those who nurtured us spiritually, and today serving as bishops to those who nurtured us spiritually. Then in politics, I think Mayor Baker told you, we only had 3 members of city council. And I think we had, the senator and someone else in the legislature,
senator,
2 members.
Henrietta.
And two.
Wasn't Henrietta then?
Yeah.
2 members in the General Assembly.
She was the first one.
Yeah.
Today, because of a lot of work that was done, and a lot of it was done by women. When I ran for office, as Mayor Baker told you, there were not that many individuals who were serving in elected office in the African American community. Today, we have control of city council. We have 2 members of county council. We have more members in the state legislature, and Delaware's first African American congressman, Lisa Rochester.
Yes.
We have always, as African American women, understood our role as nurturers, as supporters, and also for being in the vanguard. In the criminal justice system, we were the people who took the children when they were taken in during 68, when they were taken. We were there sitting in the court all day making sure that any justice that was to be administered was administered in a way that it didn't harm as negatively as it could our children. Today, we are now dealing with a criminal justice system which is taking our children in handcuffs out of the schools. Junior high and high schools all have police located on site, and the discipline issues which are occurring, not as has been stated before, these children are acting any different than other children, but because the people who are being engaged to teach them, A, do not understand them, B, are afraid of them, and C, do not resort to teaching them better conduct, but also attempt to make sure that they get them out of their sphere of influence. One of the things when Mayor Baker was mayor that happened in Wilmington was that money was invested in prevention programs. And when money was invested in prevention programs, and community centers were open. Our children at this point are being bused 9 of their 12 school years to some community somewhere that they had to get on the bus for at 6 o'clock and came back at 2 and 3 o'clock. We continue to fault the victim because the very system that was in place for 30-some years, now going on 40, did not produce a better education for our children. Produced long bus rides, is now faulting our children for their inability to teach them. We should not be faulting the victims. We should be looking at the system. Want to say that I actually know, and I'm looking at the diversity in the audience. Race is a social construct of this country. It allowed those who oppressed others for their economic gain to readily identify them. So we will never be able to step outside our race, but the issues confronting us are less about race and more about greed. And until we stop permitting race, fear, and shame to allow us to come together to talk about the solutions for these issues, if, as the study indicated, and it probably is right on target, the educational levels of African Americans have improved, but their economic status and their social economic condition has not, we no longer can continue to say that we are a merit-based society. Merit is based on ability and competence. If we are achieving a reduction in the education gap and we're still getting the same results, there's something wrong with what is going on. We talk about the role of African American women. Before Mayor Baker became mayor, he did in 1979, May 9th, he put all kinds of resources and support for community action, into an endeavor to bring together the largest conference of African American women in the history of this state to address the issues that we have of concern. Not long after that, my Caucasian sisters, so I'm saying this because as we begin to talk about how we address these issues, we need to talk about not just someone being an ally, giving verbal support to addressing these issues, but also someone being an associate or an accomplice, that you are actively taking steps to make sure that those people who are in policy, making policy for all of us, are doing it to the benefit of all of us, irrespective of race, irrespective of color, irrespective of religion. We are now a nation in crisis, not only because we're divided along economic lines, but because we are divided by artificial distinctions that keep us from collectively coming together to address these issues. 50 years later, look at what's happening in the Caucasian community. You're not a lot better off than we are, but you started from a higher point. So to be where you are is better than you used to be, but is not as good as we all can be as a society. As the Kerner Commission said, we should not be two societies, one black, one white. Artificial distinctions that have no relevance. To me and all of the people sitting on this stage as African Americans, it makes a lot of difference because it impacts us so much more severely. You sit by and you fail to stand up for what's right. When those same conditions come to oppress you, and they are. We had an issue with drugs in our community. It was called crack cocaine.
60s.
Now, in Delaware, it's called heroin. The answer to crack cocaine was to incarcerate,
right.
and a war on drugs. The new proposal is, despite the fact that heroin is taking us away from here, and I do believe 2 deaths from heroin occurred in Delaware last week, we now are talking about medical treatment for a disease. It's all a disease, but the real issue, and I think everyone at this table has said it, is the malaise that makes us as a society think it is necessary to use any substance to anesthetize the pain that we feel from not being able to come together, not being able to reach solutions, and not being able to acknowledge and admit that some of the things that are happening are unfair. But if you turn your head when it's happening to us, it's just a matter of time before it's on your door. And if we don't think number 45 is going to make sure that if you're not uber rich, that you're not included in the public policy, we need to think again.
Okay. All right, thank you. Dr. Morton, we have about 10 minutes. So here's my question to you in terms of kind of bringing everything to a close. And I'm going to probably misquote Martin Luther King, but you'll have the gist of what was said. But Martin Luther King is quoted as saying, "Lord, I think I'm integrating my people into a burning house."
Right.
I don't know whether I got that right or not, but I'm close to it. Will you share with us, and again, we have about 10 minutes left before we have to close down. Share with us your perceptions of the pace of progress in Delaware and Wilmington since the 1960s.
Thank you for inviting me from the farm team. Wasn't really supposed to be on the panel, but I appreciate the opportunity to share. There's an African proverb that says, "Unless the lion has his own storyteller, that history will always favor the hunter." And what that simply means is the narrative, the nomenclature, the way in which we frame the conversation has to change. Everyone up here today made valid points and points that I want to make sure that we highlight. It was Mark Hill on this very campus when we formed the Complexities of Color Coalition who said that we're asking the wrong questions. That the question that we oftentimes ask is, how does it feel to drive while black? When in fact, the real question is, how does it feel to patrol while racist? Right? He also says, instead of asking what it means to drop out, we ought to ask what it means to push students out. That it's that in many schools you have metal detectors to get in, but nobody is stopping you from leaving. So we've got to be able to ask different questions. It was also Dr. Yaba Blay on that same panel from Drexel University, who is the progenitor of the One Drop Project, who said that we have to stop polite conversations, right? That instead of talking about racism, we really ought to talk about white supremacy, right? That what we are really discussing here tonight is this idea that one people group, simply by a skin politic, is better than another people group. We have to fight the idea that there is an inferiority simply based on hue. And yes, I would also venture to say that blackness is not an anthropological reality. Blackness is an ontological reality. That is to say that blackness is not a matter of hue, it is a matter of what a person possesses on the inside. Everybody your color ain't your kind. And what that then means is you can have somebody as dark as Clarence Thomas and be the whitest white person. You can have somebody as light as Tim Wise and be the darkest dark person, because blackness is not an anthropological reality, is an ontological one. Not much has changed, and I think a part of what we have to wrestle with is what our dear brother shared earlier, and that is we're dealing with a society that begins with a theological construct. We began talking about what my wonderful mother, I'm a mama's boy, so I'm going to call her name a couple of times. What my mom talked about, the importance of the black church. I was quoted in a Delaware Today article that they did on me, that if black communities are to survive and thrive, it begins with returning the black church to the epicenter of black life. Yeah. Unless we're willing to do that, we're not going to see the kinds of strides that we really need to see. I had a conversation with Matt Den at the shooting, after the shooting, the execution really, of Jeremy Ban McDowell. And he said that a part of what has to change is the policies around policing and their ability to execute deadly force. Right? Right now, the way that the law stands, you can execute deadly force if you are in fear of your life. Yep. The problem with that is, particularly with white officers, is there is data, that is empirical data, that would suggest to us that white officers are intrinsically fearful of black flesh, which is the reason for which there's a hypercriminalization of black flesh, an over-incarceration of black flesh, and a hyper-execution of black flesh. And until we're willing to address that as a central problem and theme of our social ill, then we're always going to have, and return to panels like this to continue to discuss the problem. And I appreciate all of the work that this university is doing, and universities across the country to address the issue. Delaware investigates too much, incarcerates too much, and executes too much. Yes. And we really have to address those issues. But if politics is the acquisition, maintenance, and execution of power, right? That we acquire power through the vote, that we maintain that power through the vote, and that we execute that power through the vote, then a part of what we have to be able to do is to get to the polls. And even though we have a greater and broader table with regard to black participation in the electorate, we still don't have as much power, because the black middle class has a bourgeois attitude that suggests that you are better than me based on where you live and the education you have. Delaware State University invites me to speak often in their Department of Social Work, their master's program. And a part of what I've always shared with them is they have their feet in both worlds, particularly the minority population have their feet in both worlds. You got your feet in one hand as a member of the minority part of our society, but then you're educated. And so a part of what happens is we enter a space And now we're educated and we look down on the very people we became educated to help.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same problem, quite frankly, in the black church. The black church does the same thing. The black church, politics, and all of those spaces that have been created that we forced our way into as members of the black life, of black life, we have become the very oppressors that we were designed to fight. We've become a part of the majority dominant class of individuals that continue to oppress. I base politics and government and grade them based upon how willing they are to help the vulnerable of our society. And if they're not willing to help the vulnerable of our society, and they want power simply to have power without executing that power to uplift someone who needs them, those that have been relegated to the margins, then we are in a greater problem than we think we are. So finally, in the last 75 seconds, which is a Baptist minute, let me simply say that one of the things that we fight is we fight social media. But let me tell you what social media has done. Social media did not introduce new problems, it unveiled historic ones.
That's right. That's right.
Right? And a part of now what happens with social media is you have the ability to introduce again to the a voice of a younger population who introduced to our society what should have been available all the time, and that is a journalistic integrity. Yeah. So now you have smartphones that are viewing police brutality that you didn't have before. Didn't mean that it didn't exist. It just means that it went covered and opaque because nobody was there courageous enough to be able